So our next speaker is Joan Monras, who's going to speak about immigration and spatial equilibrium, the role of expenditures in the country of origin. Again, as we said before, you have roughly 45 minutes, and I'll signal the time remaining only once 5 minutes before the time is up. Is it okay with you?
Okay, sounds perfect.
Okay, so you have the floor. Thank you.
Let me just jump into it. Okay, so that's joint work with Christoph Albert, who's a postdoc at TEMFI. So previously we circulated this paper as Immigrants' Residential Choices and Their Consequences. We've worked on this paper, and there are a few changes relative to previous versions, but the main message is the same. So let me jump straight into this one. So for those of you knowing the literature on immigration, there's a large number of papers that basically compare high to low immigrant locations, usually cities. And these type of comparisons have been used to, for example, learn what are the labor market effects of immigration. In this literature, there's at the same time a relatively high effort in trying to deal with the potentially endogenous location of immigrants, right? So in the case of labor market effects, it's well known that perhaps immigrants go to wherever wages are higher, and that may be a concern for endogeneity. Now, in some sense, what we argue in this paper is that we know relatively little about how immigrants decide where to live within host economies, other than sort of the two underlying theories that are behind this literature in the cross-city comparisons. First is, well, immigrants probably move to where there's high demand for labor. That was the source of endogeneity concern. Second, immigrants tend to settle to where previous immigrants moved into, right? And that has been the basis of the immigrant networks instrument, which is one of the most widely used instruments in this literature. Now, what we do in this paper is, so we start from arguably a simple observation, which is that an important part of immigration actually likely takes place or takes as references the prices in their countries of origins. What do we mean by this? So many immigrants send remittances. And so to the extent that they care about how these remittances are spent in their country of origin is as if they were consuming in their country of origin. Many immigrants actually return to their countries of origin after some years and in the host economy, and so it may mean savings for future in the home economy, or it may just mean time allocation, right? So going back to your country of origin for the summer. Now, what we do in this paper is we build on this observation to think about what are the incentives governing immigrant location choices. And the main claim that we put forward is that relative to natives, immigrants care relatively less about the local price index. Think about the housing, and if they consume a fraction of their income in their countries of origin. Okay, and the idea, so hopefully it will become very clear at least by the end of the talk, right? So if as a fraction of your total expenditures, the local goods take a small fraction of your local expenditures, then you care relatively less about these local expenditures. And hence, if you're deciding between a place that is twice more expensive, but where wages are twice higher versus another one that it's half-half, the natives may be indifferent between these two types of locations, whereas the immigrants systematically will choose the high price, high wage location. Okay, and so that's basically what this paper does. Let me highlight what we think are the contributions. So the paper has two different parts. The first is to document a number of different empirical facts, many of which had not been documented before, which we argue that if we want to explain all these facts together, then thinking about immigration in the way I was highlighting is probably the right way to go, right? In particular, we document that immigrants concentrate in large and more expensive cities. So that we knew to some extent, but we document this much more systematically. Second, if you think that part of the wage, part of the value of living in a large and expensive city is transferred or is absorbed into wages, then what we should be seeing is that the gap in wages between immigrants and natives is larger in these more expensive cities, okay? And that's something that we document also very extensively. Third, which is going to be particularly important for our stories, we document significant heterogeneity across immigrants from different countries of origin, right? And in particular, if you think that there's some degree of substitutability between consuming where you live and where you come from, then the relative concentration of immigrants into expensive cities and the gap in wages between immigrants of particular countries of origin and natives should be larger for those immigrants who have higher incentives to consume in their countries of origin. Okay, and so we can we document these making cross-country comparisons. So is it the case that indeed Mexicans concentrate more in New York than Germans? But also we can use exchange rate fluctuations to see if Mexicans concentrate more in New York when the peso is relatively low relative to when the peso is high. Okay, so so we make these two comparisons. We also do a number of other, or we document a number of other heterogeneity. So for instance, if you think that immigrants become more like natives as they spend time in the US, and so that they spend a smaller fraction of their income back in their countries of origin, then this would suggest that the effects that we document should attenuate for immigrants who have been for more years in the US, which indeed is what we find. Similar, you may think that if you're a documented immigrant, you're maybe more likely to stay in the US longer or forever. And we can exploit variation in America to show that the effects attenuate for documented immigrants. Okay. Now, the fourth thing that we put forward is that the driving mechanism behind these patterns in the cross-section across cities and by country of origin is driven by how immigrants consume. And in particular, that immigrants consume differently than comparable native households, right? And the numbers we document there is that if we compare two households with similar education, similar local labor market, similar income, immigrants' total expenditure on local consumption is around 20% lower, which is an order of magnitude that it's similar to the remittances that many immigrants send to their countries of origin. We can further break this down by immigrants spending around 10% less on local rents, which is the largest part of local expenditures. And finally, we can also document some heterogeneity by country of origin following exchange rate fluctuations. Okay, so that's in terms of the empirics, or the main part of the empirics. Now, what we do in terms of, so we understand these facts basically through the lenses of a spatial equilibrium model, where the only innovation that we put there is that the immigrants take, there's a part of the consumption of immigrants that takes these goods that they cannot consume in the host economy, but rather that they need to consume in their countries of origin, right? And again, to make this simpler in the model, we're going to be thinking about these as amenities and how much utility immigrants get from this possibility of sending money to their relatives. Right? From this model, what we're going to derive is the consequences on location patterns and wages. And just to restate, so basically, immigrants are going to have incentives to go and live in the most expensive locations. And if there's some bargaining in the labor market, the gap in wages is going to be larger for immigrants relative to natives in these more expensive locations. Once we have this model, we're going to estimate it using 1990 data, and we use it to make some counterfactuals to understand the role of shaping the distribution of economic activity across locations. what we argue is that the model does a good job at explaining, at matching the distribution of population and wages across the different metropolitan areas in the US. And we explain well some non-targeted movements. In particular, the model does a very good job at explaining the heterogeneity in local consumption from immigrants from for different countries of origin, which is not a moment that it's targeted when we estimate the model. And it does also a very good job at predicting the cross-metropolitan area population changes over the 90s, right? So remember that the model was estimated using cross-sectional variation across different cities for the year 1990. And so we can look whether indeed the inflows of immigrants during the 90s located in these large and more expensive cities, how these changed by country of origin. And we can see also what happened to the relocation of natives. And what we'll show is that these patterns are very much in line in the data with what the model would predict, okay? Now, just to give you two main takeaways from the overall exercise that we do. The first one is that through this mechanism, basically immigrants are affecting the distribution of economic activity. And in particular, they're moving an economic activity towards large and more expensive cities, which from the viewpoint of a standard spatial equilibrium, they tend to be the most productive locations. At the same time, we're going to show that there's going to be some natives who are priced out from these large and more expensive locations who, according to the model, relocate into smaller locations. And that's something that we also see in these exercises that we look at relocation over the 90s. Second main takeaway is that through this mechanism, there's some general equilibrium output gain from immigration in the sense that immigrants are moving more economic activity towards more productive locations, and just from a general equilibrium standpoint, that's gonna increase the overall productivity, okay? We're also gonna argue, or we argue in the paper, that these gains of immigration are magnified if agglomeration externalities are strong, and if there are housing policies that are put in place that allow or that decrease this displacement of natives from these large and more expensive locations. Okay, just to conclude the introduction, let me emphasize that what this paper is saying is that immigrants not only grease the wheels of the labor market in the Borjas 2001 type of meaning, so it's not that they go just to places that are high in the demand for labor, but that they systematically choose to locate in the most productive cities. Okay, so for the rest of the talk, I'm gonna first introduce briefly the data. I'm then gonna show the empirical facts that I was referring to. And then I'll introduce the model, estimation, and quantitative results, okay? So in terms of data, basically we use a bunch of different data sets, most of which are publicly available on IPUM. So mostly census data, but we've replicated all the results also with CPS data. That allows us to compute wages and population. We look at metropolitan area price index data by using the word of Moretti, which basically combines the price of housing with other expenditures to basically compute a local price index for each city. It really doesn't matter whether we use this local price index of Moretti or just the local housing costs. Then we use exchange rate data from the World Bank, consumption data from the consumption expenditure survey data. And we also use something I didn't explain in the introduction. We use Mexican flows data to see the origin and destination of Mexican migrants and how this relates to GDP per capita in their destination and origin, okay? All right, so in terms of empirical facts, so the first one is immigrants concentrate in large and expensive cities. I'm going to show here only the price results. What does this mean? It means that if we regress the relative concentration of immigrants into particular location. So that's the number of immigrants that we observe in CDC relative to all immigrants. And all these relative to the natives in that location relative to all natives. And we regress that on the MSA price index. If we get a positive estimate, it basically means that immigrants concentrate in these expensive locations, okay? So if we do this type of cross-sectional regressions, so I'll show you how it looks like for the year 2000, but we find similar relationships for essentially every single year that we have in our sample. We get a very strong and positive relationship between this relative immigrant share and the price index of the location, okay? So that's the first fact. So immigrants disproportionately concentrate in this more expensive city. And in fact, this correlation is stronger when we look at price index and when we look at, say, city size. Second main thing that we document is that the gap in wages between natives and immigrants is larger in these more expensive cities. Okay, and so what does this mean is basically that the wages of immigrants relative to natives in New York, so there's a bigger gap in New York than there is in a smaller location. Now, how do we document this? There are several ways in which we can do this, but the main complication is whether the labor market is well characterized by one factor of production or many, right? And to take into account, and in particular, what may be challenging is whether natives and immigrants are imperfect or perfect substitutes, okay? Now, what we do is we basically purge the wage data from observable characteristics and from potential labor supply shocks at the local level for each of the different education and experience cells, okay? Now, those are essentially the CART 2009 type regressions. This is the regression where if gamma is different than 0, it would suggest that immigrants and natives are imperfect substitutes, right? If gamma is equal to 0, then they're perfect substitutes. So what we do is using the exact same specification, we show that we obtain the same CART results. Now, when we include city times year fixed effects, this gamma is essentially 0. So suggesting that when we're controlling for this trend in the relative wage gap between immigrants and natives, so we don't, this gamma becomes, is estimated to be 0. And what this city times year fixed effect captures is the wage gap prevailing in the city purged of potential labor supply shocks, observable characteristics. I forgot to put here the controls. And we also allow for skill specific fixed effects. Okay, so to reiterate on this, so this fee estimate is going to be the wage gap between natives and immigrants purged of potential imperfect substitutability between natives and immigrants and of observable characteristics. Okay, now what is the second step is
can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
Before the regression, just some summary statistic. Like, do we know where does this wage gap come from? Is it because they are in different occupation? They are in different sectors? Do we know anything like that?
Yeah, so you should think about this as within occupations within. So it doesn't really matter whether you add, for example, occupation or industry fixed effects or anything like this, right? So it's really inside a narrowly defined occupation, education, experience cell.
Okay.
How does the gap in wages compare between natives and immigrants?
Okay.
And taking into account also the potential labor supply shock induced by immigrants.
I also missed the beginning. These are all immigrant, right? Including
Yeah.
those who has a document or who is illegal.
Yeah, so in the paper, we basically show results for everyone, for documented, for undocumented. Bottom line is it doesn't really matter whether you include all of them or not. The
It's just
results
curious,
are
how do you get wage for illegal immigrants?
so for undocumented immigrants, what you can do is basically you can identify them relatively well only among the low skill, right? And the way the literature has done that is by basically looking in the census whether the immigrants participate in welfare programs that require legal status, right? And so basically you assume that everyone is undocumented up until you see that they participate in a program that requires legal status, right? And so obviously, if you move up the income, uh, then you're making more and more mistakes, right? Because there may be immigrants with high incomes that don't participate into any welfare program just because their income is sufficiently high, right? And so, but we can identify pretty well the undocumented among the low skill.
So final question is, do you look into the probability of getting job at all? Like
we do. So it's in the appendix. So we don't find a systematic relationship between the job finding rate or the immigrant unemployment or employment rate and city prices. Okay, so it does not seem that it's driven by the fact that immigrants may find more easily jobs in one place than in another. Okay. All right, so once we've purged the wage data from these potential concerns, then we basically relate this measure of the wage gap between natives and immigrants and the price level in the different cities. Let me just highlight that if this beta P is positive, the potential explanation behind this is that the demand for immigrants in the labor market is just higher in these more expensive cities. Instead, if this beta is negative, it's more a story of the relative supply in this of immigrants in these expensive cities, right? And so I'll come back to that later also when talking about the model. What do we get? We get a strong negative relationship. Okay, so let me restate that again. So the gap in wages between immigrants and natives is just higher in places like New York than it is in smaller locations. Okay. We can put this in terms of regressions, and we can, in particular, instrument the local price index by the housing supply elasticity estimates at the metropolitan area provided by size. You see that those results remain pretty much the same. Okay. Right, so those are the first two facts. Third fact is, well, so those facts are very robust in the data. Is there some heterogeneity that can perhaps tell us what may be driving these two facts, right? And we provide numerous pieces of evidence on this heterogeneity. I'll show you only some of those, but let me describe everything that we do, or most of the things that we do and that you can find in the paper. So the first thing that I'm going to show is basically use price of origin variation. Okay. To the extent that you think that there may be some degree of substitutability between consuming where you live and where you come from, this suggests that this relative concentration and this bigger wage gap should be even larger for immigrants that come from low price index countries of origin. Okay, again, so those are cross-country comparisons. We can use also within country of origin variation and with exchange rate data to highlight or to use within country of origin variation. Okay, so we show these results. I'll show you these results using census data in a second. We find similar results using CPS data. The second piece of evidence that we show in the paper is that if you think about it, what this idea suggested that immigrants from low income Mexican states should disproportionately move to high income US states of destination. Okay, and so we have this matricula consular data on Mexican flows from each origin in Mexico and each destination in the US. And what we can document is that it's systematically the case that Mexicans from low GDP per capita states of origins locate in high GDP per capita states in the US. The third piece of heterogeneity that we document is that this relationship attenuates for immigrants who arrived a long time ago in the US, and so perhaps less attached to their country of origin. And the fourth is this variation using IRCA that legalized the working status of immigrants who made it into the US just before 1982. And so using this discontinuity to see if these patterns attenuate for immigrants, for documented immigrants. Okay, so all this, it's in the paper. Let me just show the first piece of evidence, okay, which is gonna be the one that it's crucial for the estimation of the model. Okay, so how can we do that? It's basically extending the regressions that I already showed, right? So what is the relative concentration of immigrants into location C, origin O, country of origin O, at a given point in time, all these relative to the concentration of natives into that location. Okay, and we can explain this as before by the local price index. Sorry, this O should not be here. The local price index and the interaction of this local price index and the exchange rate. Okay, and so what we would expect is that if this alpha 3 is negative, it means that immigrants from low price indices tend to disproportionately locate in expensive locations. Okay, now we can add country of origin fixed effects to use just within variation. In that case, we're going to be capturing fluctuations in the exchange rate and how these determine the relative locations of immigrants from a particular country of origin. Okay, the mirror image of these relative locations is how the wage gaps evolve between immigrants from each country of origin and natives. And again, that's going to be sort of the mirror image of the relative location results. And so if beta 3 it's positive, then it means that the gap in wages between immigrants and natives in big cities relative to cheaper cities is bigger for the immigrants who come from low price index countries of origin. Okay, so let me show these results. So in the first column, we look at this immigrant concentration. And in particular, the coefficient of interest is this interaction between the price index in the location, think about housing prices again, and the exchange rate. This coefficient is negative, suggesting that immigrants from low price index countries of origins concentrate more in expensive locations. Okay, the mirror image of this coefficient is basically the coefficient on the relative on the wage gap. Okay. Now, one thing that you may have thought about is, well, perhaps this is driven or this is shaped by, yeah, there's a question.
No, go ahead. So I had a question, but if you, perhaps you want to, I was just wondering whether, whether if you split the sample between, say, like rich and poor countries, this is just driven by poor countries, or?
No, so you have variation all over the place. So in the paper, you can see the graph. So it's basically a, so you have variation pretty much. So it's not driven just by Mexicans, right? Or it's not just driven by immigrants from Latin America or anything like that. All right, so you may wonder whether or how much these results may be affected if, by including the immigrant networks, right? So perhaps you have a story in which, you know, the relative concentration of immigrants into certain locations is not driven by what I'm emphasizing, but by the fact that the immigrant network is larger in certain locations than in others. Okay. Now, there's still an initial question: why did this immigrant network become larger in certain locations and not some others? But So if we control for the immigrant network instrumented by the initial settlements, then you see basically that the results don't change very significantly. And the immigrant network is a good predictor of the relative concentration of immigrants across locations, and has a negative effect on the wages that immigrants of particular countries of origins get at destination. So it can easily be interpreted as an amenity value, as an amenity shifter in the value of immigrants to live in those locations, right? But let me emphasize that it doesn't undo anything of what we are claiming in terms of the incentives of immigrants in locating in these expensive, the higher incentives of immigrants in locating in these more expensive locations. Okay, I can come back to that point later with the model. All right, so what is this evidence consistent with for the moment? So immigrants have more incentives than natives to live in these more expensive locations. If they value living in these cities, they have incentives to accept lower wages than natives, and immigrant networks can be understood as an amenity value of destinations. What we claim in the paper is that what's driving these results is that part of what immigrants consume is related to their country of origin. So let me show some results on how immigrants consume locally relative to similar looking natives. Again, in the paper, we show much more than what I'm going to be able to show here. But basically, immigrants remit a large fraction of their income. That was well documented using German data. We confirmed this with data for the US. We can also look at aggregate remittance data from the US to the many countries of origin and look at what are the wages of these immigrants sending remittances. And that's equivalent to roughly 20% of their income. Second thing that we look at is immigrants are less likely to own a house relative to similar looking natives. They also tend to spend less on local rents. And there is some heterogeneity by country of origin that is in line with what I've been saying. With consumption expenditure survey data, we can only identify Mexicans, but we can look at how do Mexicans consume in total relative to similar looking natives, right? And let me emphasize this similar looking, what it means. It means that we can control for household income, all the household characteristics, and we can include location fixed effects, right? And so we're comparing similar households in the same location.
Can I ask a question? Hello?
Yeah.
So that's very interesting. I was thinking, do you have any information about where the families of these immigrants are located? I mean, if a Mexican family lives in Mexico City or in a sorry, I don't have my video. Yeah. So if it lives in Mexico City or in a poor area, then the same argument should apply somehow.
So yeah, so two points to this to what you're mentioning. So the first thing is, well, unfortunately, we don't have data for a household that lives in the US. How many household members do they have in their country of origin? Okay. Now, what we have is the size of the household. So we can look at heterogeneity by household size of the immigrants in the US. Okay, and what we see is that immigrant households that are smaller tend to spend a smaller fraction of their income in the US. Okay, so we don't know for sure that the immigrant household is smaller because it just happens to be smaller, because some of they have some family members in Mexico.
I was thinking about perhaps something else. This is also interesting on its own,
okay.
But I was thinking that if your family lives in Mexico, so if the remittance goes to Mexico City or to a rural area of Mexico, the price level is going to be different in these two locations, and then the same type of consideration is going to apply.
Definitely.
So for theory, the people whose family live in a poor area of Mexico should locate even more, I guess, in the
that's exactly
Manhattan.
So we do document this very extensively. So unfortunately, I cut this regression table. I'm pretty sure, yeah. But basically, what we have is so the flow of Mexicans from each state of origin in Mexico towards each state of destination in the US, right? And so we cannot do this at the metropolitan area level in Mexico or the metropolitan area of destination in the US. But what we can see is that Mexicans from the poor the poor states of origin in Mexico disproportionately locate in the high GDP per capita states in the US. Okay, which speaks very directly to what you had in mind.
Yeah, exactly. That's very interesting.
All right, now what I did include in the paper is what's the size of this smaller local expenditure of immigrants relative to natives, and then here again, so with consumption expenditure survey data, we can only identify essentially Mexicans. So they tend to spend around 20% less locally than similar looking natives households. Rents, it's around 18%. When we can look also at monthly rents in the census data, that number is a little bit lower, but here we can identify all immigrants, not just Mexicans. In any case, those are the orders of magnitude of the importance of the home country in overall expenditure for immigrants, okay, on average. I'll come back to this number when I discuss the model. All right, so let me introduce the model. So let me first say that our point is, we think, very general. Okay, so all we need is immigrants deriving positive utility from consuming a good that cannot be consumed in the host economy. So essentially having this extra good in their utility function relative to natives. Now, in terms of the labor market, we can think about two scenarios. So if we have perfect competition, we could generate some of these results with imperfect substitution between natives and immigrants, which is not in line with what we report in the data, but we could potentially generate these, except that the imperfect substitutability story would require that would not be able to explain the heterogeneity across immigrant groups, unless there's a systematic relationship between this elasticity of substitution between natives and immigrants and the exchange rate fluctuations, which we think is very unlikely to be the case. Now, with imperfect competition in the labor market, then we'll show that very naturally local wages reflect, at least in part, the value for an individual from a particular country of origin to live in a particular location. Now, what's the fundamental intuition behind the spatial, behind the model is just that, so if you think about spatial equilibrium model and natives location choice is exclusively based on real wages, it means that they look for the place that has higher real wages, so wages relative to local cost of living. Think about housing costs. What we're saying is that immigrants' location is based on the wages that they receive in that particular destination and a weighted average between the local housing cost and how much it costs for them to spend money in their countries of origin, right? And so this PJ is going to be the price index in the country of origin. Now you can rearrange that and you can immediately see that while natives decide based exclusively on real wages, immigrants are deciding where to locate using a weighted average between the real wages and nominal wages, right? And so they have strong incentives to locate in high nominal wage locations, which in the case of the spatial equilibrium, it's also going to be these expensive locations. Okay, so what I'm going to do in the following slides is just a quantitative version of this model, allowing for immigrant networks, which speaks to the empirical results that I just showed. Okay.
Yeah, I can ask another question. So
sure.
I guess what I'm pointing out will go in the same direction of what you're thinking. So you're thinking about remittances, but I think another mechanism could be dynamics. So, you know, many people think to move back to their own countries. So, you know, then if you see that they actually save more, yeah, you said that it's somehow matched by the remittances. But yeah, so if there is any evidence that these people would save more for the future, that might suggest that they want to go back to accounting. That's another reason to go to a high wage location.
Yeah, so right after this, so again, so this from the viewpoint of the model, it doesn't. So it's a static model, so it doesn't matter if it's just remittances or future consumption. For in this dynamic sense, all that matters is that immigrants can save a fraction of their income, right? Then these incentives for locating in the expensive location, it doesn't matter if they save more or less, right? It's just that they can save part of their income, right? If it's 10% in any potential location at destination, then they're still gonna have higher incentives to locate in New York.
Yes, I guess, in terms of a future project, one could try to, it seems interesting to distinguish. So some community maybe move back, are more interested in going back to their countries, and some don't go back that much. So that information would give you some additional data.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I fully agree with that. We provide some evidence on return migration, but it's so it's sometimes hard to know to compute the return migration rates by country of origin, right? Because you typically don't see people in the two countries, right? And so we propose a method which is based on missing observations, given that we know the year of arrival. So we can discuss this more in detail, but the answer is, it could be entirely driven by return migration, not just remittances.
Joan, you have
right, so let me
5 minutes left. Okay.
Okay, perfect. Okay.
Do you have maybe something about like travel? Sorry, would you have something maybe about travel too? Going back to Fabrizio's question. So
yeah,
presumably
we did,
people,
Yeah, so we did do something like this with Mexicans, right? So so if you think that Mexicans closer to the border can consume a larger fraction of their income in Mexico, then the pattern should be stronger for the Mexicans who live in the US closer to the Mexican border relative to those who live further away, right? And the patterns are in line with the story that I'm telling. That's what we did in terms of that. All right, so just to give you a flavor of the more quantitative model. So basically, utility in a location for an individual who comes from country J and decides to locate in city C. Basically, you have the amenity value of that location, which may be specific to your country of origin. And then you have a Cobb-Douglas between tradable goods and non-tradable goods. And then these non-tradable goods are a CS composite of goods that you consume at destination, think about housing, and goods that you consume at origin, think about these remittances or future consumption. Okay. Now, the amenities are going to be country specific, and in particular, we're going to assume that there's a common component to everyone and then a specific component that depends on your country of origin. You can immediately think about this as the network, as the size of your network. And here, the main difference between natives and immigrants is that immigrants are not going to spend any fraction of their income in their countries of origin. Okay, so we could think about internal migration, but differences are bigger. Differences in price indices are bigger across countries of origin, across countries, than they are within the US. So from this utility, we get this indirect utility that basically gives you the amenity value for everyone, the wages that everyone gets, and a local price index that it's a CS composite of the local price index. Think about the housing costs and the prices in the country of origin. Okay, and we add an idiosyncratic taste shock, which we assume it's extreme value distributed. This assumption buys us a closed form solution for the relative location of the different of immigrants from the different countries of origin based on the value they obtain from living in all potential destinations. Okay. Now, in terms of the how we think about labor markets, and I'll be a little bit quick here, all we need is that part of the value is transferred of living in a location is transferred into wages. And the way we do this is by allowing nice bargaining between workers and firms, okay, with a certain weight for the workers. And what this does is basically it makes the wages the mirror image of the location choices. In terms of the housing market, just to point two things that happen at the same time. First, that immigrants prefer expensive locations relative to natives. And so in those locations, they're gonna expand the demand for housing. However, they consume a smaller fraction locally, right? So overall, they're gonna reduce the demand for housing. Okay, so that's something that shows up later in the quantification of the model. What do we get from this model is basically the relationships that we just saw in the data, right? So how do wage gaps of immigrants from different countries of origin relative to natives relate to the local price index, and how they're shaped by the price index in the country of origin, right? And how the wage gaps and the location choices are just mirror image to each other. And from this, we can also get the full distribution of where people locate within host economies. Okay. Now, two main results. As I was saying in the introduction, there's this distributional effect. So immigrants have an advantage for living in the most productive locations. And so they essentially move economic activity towards those locations, but they price out some natives from those locations. And there's a general equilibrium effect, which is that obviously you're moving more production into these more productive locations. So overall, you gain. A little bit short on time, so I don't know exactly how to handle that. I can either skip the estimation and show some final results, perhaps.
Yeah,
sorry, yeah.
I think you can have another few minutes, 3-4 minutes maximum, okay?
Okay, so let me skip a little bit the details of the estimation. Let me just give the identification intuition. Okay, so we need 4 key parameters. One is the average importance of the consumption in the home economy, in the home country economy. Okay, and we identified this from aggregate remittances. There's alternative ways in which we can identify that. Second, we need to capture this heterogeneity by country of origin, which is identified from these differences in wage gap across metropolitan areas by country of origin that I already showed. We need to capture the amenity value of these networks, which I showed already in the regressions. And finally, we need to capture the sensitivity of location choices. So how much of a mirror image is what we observe in wages to what we observe in location choices. This is this lambda parameter, okay? So those are the key parameters. Let me point only, the important one is that this elasticity of substitution is larger than 2, and that this alpha F, which is the weight of origin goods in consumption, is a number that it's roughly or similar to this 20% that I mentioned early on. Okay, so for the final thing of the talk, I'm gonna basically skip the goodness of fit, but I'm gonna compare and I'm gonna do just some counterfactors. Okay. Sorry, I'm gonna just show one of the non-targeted moments, and then I'm gonna conclude with just mentioning the counterfactors. Okay, so one of the non-targeted moments is, remember, so we estimate the model using data across metropolitan areas and countries of origin for the year 1990. The model has some predictions on what should we observe given the flow of immigrants that we observe in the data over the 90s. Okay, and in particular, we should see that these immigrants here in blue locate into the most productive locations, okay, which is exactly what we see in the data. And then because they increase the demand for housing in those locations relative to other locations, they should displace some natives from these highly productive locations into less productive locations. Okay, so that's what we see in the data. That's what the model generates, right? And as you can see, there's a lot more dispersion in the data than in the model, but the patterns are very similar between the two. Okay, and again, that's a prediction on the changes in population, which is not related to how we estimated the model. Just to
please, you should conclude now.
Just to conclude, basically, let me just say that the paper starts from a simple observation, which is immigrants consume related to the country of origin. We document a bunch of facts related to this, to the intuition that comes from this simple observation, and just the main takeaway: immigrants move economic activity from low to high productive locations. Okay, I'll leave it here then.
Thank you very much, Joan. Are there any questions? Okay, it seems that I could have.
So maybe I have just one question. So the welfare effects, I guess, are actually negative then on the natives, right? Because that's what you, when they displace, that means that you have negative.
So no, yeah, so I didn't have a ton of time to discuss this, right? So a little bit what we need to think is what are the different counterfactors that you're comparing to, right? And so if the counterfactor is, if you're comparing a population expansion that is induced by immigrants or a population expansion that is induced by natives, then the welfare consequence for natives are positive, right? Why? Because there's lower demand for housing when the expansion comes from immigrants, right? And so that reduces the housing prices all over. That enough makes welfare gains for natives. Now, obviously, if your counterfactual is just you throw in more guys and you have a housing sector that has some congestion, then it's going to be negative, right? But that comes from the assumption on the fixed factor.
Okay, thank you.